And just to level set, my hope for this meeting isn't to come up with solutions. We're not going to be saying how to solve these problems. If you say the word SAT solver, I may make you turn off your video for a minute. I just want to get ideas for how people want to actually just use bundles. So the idea is to brainstorm, not to like limit the field of what we want to do yet. Because there's a lot of different things you can do with dependencies. And there's different things when we think about dependencies. Like a lot of us are used to dependencies for libraries, for software. And it's a little different when you think about installed systems versus things. So I want to make sure that we kind of think about all things without limiting ourselves too soon to coming up with solutions. Okay. Cool. I will take notes. So we have a number of new people on the call, at least me. Maybe what we normally do on these calls for the CNAB calls is if you are feeling brave, if you'd like to unmute and just say your name, what you're interested in doing, what, where you work, whatever it is, if you'd like to let us know about you and some context, that'd be great.
Yeah, I can start. So hi everyone, my name is George. I'm actually working with Sylvain in the app dev team. And I'm working on Docker app, which uses CNAB, as you know. So I'm just here to, firstly, just to listen to see how it's going, how the meetings are going, and then maybe I'll try to put my 2 cents if I have something intelligent to say.
I'm talking to myself, sorry about that. If you want to edit the HackMD and put your name in and that you were attending, that'd be great. Otherwise, I'll try to go through later and capture everyone's names. So dependencies, we have a bit of a spec right now. It was an idea that we had, and we knew a little bit. And then I started implementing this in Porter. I demoed it last week in the CNAB meeting. And we kind of realized that there was a lot of different ways dependencies could go. And we need to go back and understand what were some of the use cases for real bundles that people want to be able to do. So I thought we could walk through and understand what are different ways that people wanted to depend on other bundles. And I was hoping that if you put it in, that you could speak to it. I don't want to read through everyone's. So my favorite is, I'll do mine. Mine's the first one. So I hate understanding how to properly configure for production a cloud provider's database as a service. So think of like Azure Real SQL as a service that understands how to do backup and restore properly, is tuned, all that stuff, not just enough to get it running, but to have it properly running in production. That's something that the cloud provider would be in the best position to write a bundle for once and expose a bunch of parameters potentially. And then I'd like to be able to just reference it and know that they made a robust bundle that does all the things that meets their best practices. And I don't ever want to have to like write that bundle. I like to be able to reference it and get a production grade database that I can act with, and hopefully would have custom actions on it to like backup and restore and things like that. So there's a lot baked in there, but the idea is that I would like someone who knows way more about some domain area to be able to make a bundle that I can rely on. And then be able to use the outputs from that bundle. And then I was being picky, so I wanted to be able to say a specific version of that bundle. That was my follow-on bullet. So I think someone put down being able to use production and local development, if they could talk to that one. Are they here, whoever wrote that down? Did someone write securely inject outputs? We have a ghostwriter. Okay, who has a use case that they'd like to speak about? We'll start with that instead. Ravashi, maybe? I'm gonna pick on you.
I don't actually have like a use case, at least for within internally right now for dependencies. We were interested in it in like an earlier part, so I'm still joining as like curious about where this will go, but right now we don't have like a very specific use case. All of the ones that I'm reading that are already listed here, they make sense to me. Like they were like in line with the use cases that we were originally thinking about. Like especially like, you know, the domain, there's like some bundle out there that I don't want to write myself, but is like a generic enough, like a database that I'd want to like do. Another common example would be like a Kubernetes cluster. If I have a bundle that is basically some K8s YAML files that I want to put on a K8s cluster, but I want to make sure that the cluster has like, is compliant with what I'm going to put on there, then that would be like a good use case as well. But yeah, I don't think I can think of anything that's not already captured here from our earlier needs.
The K8s cluster one brings up a question for me. And I was curious if other people had any thoughts about this. Maybe Glenn had thoughts about this, which is when you require credentials, okay? If I require credentials for a database or for a cluster, is that sufficient to say that somebody somewhere better have spun up a database? How is the credentials that have credentials? Like, how are you filling in the credential part? Are you like manually making another bundle somewhere else, running it, and then passing the credentials along? Like I've seen Nuno do that. Like he'll make a K3D cluster, and then when he needs something else, he's passing the credentials along that way. But it's kind of like this manual step. I'm curious if anyone else is doing that. Yes, under the oldest version of Porter.
Going back to OSGI, which probably no one here is familiar with except me, that has the concept of bundles and dependencies, but they have they played with the notion of requirements and capabilities. And the idea was someone could publish a bundle could provide a capability, and another bundle could require it, and then you could satisfy that requirement without either bundle knowing about the other one physically. You know the bundle ID or anything, bundle name, that kind of thing. So it sounds similar that, you know, for credentials, you've got a bundle that provides the credentials, another one that wants the credentials, but neither necessarily know which bundle is providing or requiring them.
Yeah, I've worked with a little bit with service catalog and brokers. That sounds super familiar. We may have been ripping off OSGI. I'm not quite sure.
Incestuous.
Yeah, if I wanted to, for example, rely upon a Postgres database, but I didn't care where it came from, is that kind of what it means? Like I don't care if it was spun up on premise or in a specific cloud, I just need it to be provided by someone, and then I need the credentials. Is that what we mean by capabilities?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. I just want to make sure I can collect this in the notes here.
It seems like that use case is generally satisfied if you have some way to map CNAB outputs into CNAB parameters so take a dependency and grab an output or set of outputs from it and then map those into the parameters for the top level bundle. Is that kind of along the lines what you've been thinking, or?
Mapping the inputs and the outputs?
Yeah, the outputs into parameters or inputs.
Honestly, that hasn't been the direction I've been going, but me and Jeremy with Porter have been very hesitant because of the lack of use cases, you know?
Yeah.
It's why dependencies hasn't gone very far, very fast. So I think oftentimes, because I think when we first thought about mapping inputs and outputs, it hasn't always been a clear one-to-one map, I guess.
Yeah.
Oftentimes because the shape, the schema of the inputs and the outputs very rarely align up. There always needed to be some sort of concatenation happening or tweaks. Like just thinking about one person wanted some Spring formatted like connection string, and somebody else needed it as separate fields where one is host, port, blah, 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 everything separate, password. That's always been hard to do like a strict mapping, but maybe I'm not being creative about that.
Well, I mean, we could either provide the ability to script some kind of transform, or we run into the same problem with, well, actually, I'm not really sure I fully understand the capabilities piece that's been proposed. Like, would that come with a JSON schema that must be satisfied by the outputs of the bundles that can satisfy that that capability, or?
I think it's totally doable. I think my stumbling block has always been getting people to agree. I guess I wasn't saying that very well. Getting people to agree on what the shape of it should be, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then getting them to say, that's fine, I'll do the extra work inside my bundle to do the transformation into the shape I really need. And then saying, it's going to look like this. So say you had, well, I'll stick to databases because I'm good at them. A shape that was, every field is separate, right? And you needed something different. Like, do all bundles have to agree, or would they not have to agree? Because at some level, like my experiences with broker, like open service broker, we had to get everyone to agree that like all the Postgres databases have to give stuff in this certain format.
Yep.
Do you think that would have to happen with this, or do you see something different?
I think it definitely would if we don't build in the ability to apply arbitrary transforms. Otherwise, you would have to build in support in the top level bundle that's consuming its dependencies to take in whatever format is provided by those dependencies. Yeah, or I mean, there's probably some possibility of doing like kind of type checking the schema of outputs and comparing that to the schema of the parameters that you want to map into, and then seeing if they can be serialized or compatible with each other. And then statically being able to tell whether or not you're able to consume a bundle as a dependency in the way you want to. That also probably, I mean, for our use cases, we want to be able to pin like reference bundles as dependencies by their digest, so that we can like actually computer check some of the entire like dependency tree and assign that so that we know exactly what we're deploying, versus like saying we will accept a sim for a range. I think that would make sense for higher level tooling, but the spec might want to say that you should reference bundles by digest.
Okay, great. I just added that to the use case list.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry, that went to questions. Let me switch that.
Yeah.
Sorry for all the questions. I definitely don't intend to be contradicting. I just want to make sure I get enough information so I can write it down in the notes.
All good. I guess while we're at it on use cases, another one we have is definitely eventually to be able to deploy things like Kubernetes clusters using CNAB, right? And then we have to solve the problem of saying, well, I've got a cluster, but that's shared between multiple installations. So we need to be able to say some installation should exist before deploying this new installation of my specific application. But that probably can't actually be embedded directly in the bundle definition for the application itself. Otherwise, that has to be shared between multiple bundles, if that makes sense.
The Redis installation, the cluster.
So say we have a Node.js application that we have a bundle for, and it's deployed to Kubernetes. So we want to say, before this application can be deployed, we must also have a Kubernetes installation available to deploy to. And then we might want to grab some credentials out of that as outputs to be able to deploy that given cluster. Or like DNS config or something else that we depend on for our application. And then we want to be able to share that across multiple application bundles. So what we've kind of been exploring there a little bit is having, outside of CNAB or potentially adding to the CNAB spec in the future, a workflow spec that allows us to orchestrate multiple installations that are decoupled, but then map outputs into parameters between separate installations.
All right, I'm trying to break that down here. So we have a workflow spec. I just want to make sure I understand that because that sounds terribly interesting. Orchestrating multiple decoupled installations that can inject outputs from previously installed bundles into new ones?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
And then we can, the workflow spec would include, like, instead of having the workflow say, now I'm going to install this bundle and then now I'm going to upgrade this bundle, it would have an idempotent type of step in the workflow that's just, this installation should exist with this bundle version and this installation name, and the set of parameters. And then that same installation can then be referenced between multiple workflows and be applied. And then we won't actually, we'll run whatever the correct install or upgrade action is to get to that desired state. Anytime a given workflow is executed.
Can I ask a silly question? This sounds like it could almost be its own CNAB tool in and of itself, or am I looking at it wrong?
Yeah, it's definitely like we're interested in making like a workflow JSON part of the CNAB spec that's a higher level above a bundle JSON.
Okay.
It sounds like it falls into the responsibilities of the CNAB runtime.
Yes.
Because it has a track of like what's been installed, what bundles have been essentially executed, and then you can set up the dependency chain that way in the runtime.
I mean, there's a way to structure this if we want to. If we had the core runtime just track installed bundles and provide APIs so you could inspect them and see what's there, and enforce that when you install a bundle, its prereqs, its dependencies, if you like, are satisfied, then all the kind of resolution and installation workflow stuff could be done at a high level, could keep that out of core which I think might be a neat move, because this is going to mushroom. This is going to be absolutely enormous. I'm not sure we finish it.
That's what we're planning. It's to have kind of an API-driven CNAB Go driver interface that can do the state tracking of which installations exist and like a centralized server-side environment. And then it'll be able to take a workflow JSON as input and execute CNAB install or upgrade against whichever bundles are inside the workflow, and then map those outputs into parameters. And so that's, I mean, that's one way to accomplish that, like a shared installation being a dependency of multiple other separate bundles. But I do think it's potentially a way to solve more embedded dependencies, I guess you might say, where you've got a need for a database and you also have, say, a Helm bundle, and the database can be running on AWS or it can be running on Kubernetes as well. You don't really care. You just want out of that installation to get a connection string, right? We've been thinking about, I think the dependency spec could include that kind of capability to be within a single bundle, and then you specify which other bundle provides the outputs that you need directly within your bundle JSON. And then each bundle gets installed using the same installation name. But that does complicate things a lot. I think you can handle the same exact use case with a workflow JSON, and then just construct a graph of the dependencies and what the execution plan should be.
Yeah, the way Porter is doing it right now, and the way the original dependencies spec, which never really got adopted. So like, I don't want to like say that it matters, but just like where it originally went was that none of this was in the runtime, first of all. It was never meant to like pollute the runtime.
Yeah.
Is that the tools would come up with what's the workflow to satisfy whatever dependencies were identified by the bundle. And so Porter decided to, take that graph, figure it out, and installed each bundle into its own claim. So there wasn't like a mega claim. I think that was one of the questions.
Right.
A mega claim's kind of hard,
Mm-hmm.
So like what Porter's doing right now sounds like incredibly similar to this workflow thing. I'd love for that to be a real spec, and then we could like collaborate on it.
Yeah.
And like implement it. That'd be great, because it's incredibly similar. And then it would work really well with one of the other questions, which was if there's existing things already on the system, like Kubernetes cluster, I don't need to install a new one this time around. I can reuse it and pick it up again, which it sounds like your system is kind of, the workflow JSON stuff is kind of designed for as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I don't know if anyone else is getting super excited. It sounds cool.
The way this was framed in OSGI, it was, I'll step back from OSGI, but it was nice framing, was you have a repository of bundles and you have a set of bundles that you want to install. And the question is, which extra bundles do you need to pull from the repository to satisfy the dependencies of the set that you're installing? And how do you install that set? So it's quite abstract, that kind of view. But I've still got the question, should that orchestration stuff be part of core, or should it be a separate spec?
This is a separate spec.
Okay, I'd missed that, thank you.
Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. All of this is a separate spec.
Great.
Yeah. None of this touches core. None of this should touch the runtime. The only piece of this that touches the runtime, and this is actually already in core, is that a bundle can say that it requires an extension. And this is generic. It can say, I require the dependencies extension, or I require think of some other new spec that may come along in the future that a bundle can say, I really need this spec to be in there. I really need security or total and talk or whatever. Like, don't just run me with just core. And then the runtime has to go, okay, I'm going to respect that. So that's the only thing in place that's kind of related to this that's in core. Otherwise, everything is outside of core, either in the dependency spec or some other one that we come up with that either takes place or sits next to it.
Okay, so just to be clear, from a core point of view, you can install a bundle without its dependencies and the runtime will be happy.
From the core's point of view, if a bundle says, I require the tool that's running me to understand another extension to the CNAB specification,
yeah,
and the tool doesn't understand it, the tool is supposed to stop and not try to run the bundle.
Yeah, but for bundle to bundle dependencies, the runtime doesn't care. Core runtime doesn't care.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's great.
The runtime does not care about dependencies whatsoever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about with, if we had a separate workflow spec that is not encoded as a bundle JSON, then a bundle JSON actually would not need to have a dependencies extension section at all. It would just define its parameters and its outputs. And then the workflow spec would say how you map outputs into parameters. Does that make sense?
Would that be distributed separately from the bundle?
Yes, because it can
that
be
super worried about.
it can be, it can reference multiple independent bundles.
It doesn't sound scalable though, does it? Because if there's thousands of bundles, how many workflow specs are there going to be?
Depends. Yeah, I've been mostly concerned with just like figuring out what the API might look like or what the shape of the workflow spec might look like. But I think there would immediately be a need for tooling to generate those workflows.
I think this is a hard problem. We actually had the same exact problem in Cloud Foundry for Bosch, which is like the orchestration tool for jobs. And you can have a very similar type of dependency between jobs. So you can have a database job that depends on like some app, and you want to share, generically across any database and any app, those sets of credentials. So the way that they solved it, and I think just maybe even taking a look at it, could be like a straw man at the very least of how to get this working. But the way they solved it is through a feature within Bosch called links, where they had this concept of like, they from our use case, like they basically didn't think about it from mapping parameters to outputs, but just having a completely different section within a job that said that this job provides this set of information, and here's another job that consumes it. And then there's some like templating that happens that allows you to be able to like consume the exact links that are in there. So I can actually send a link to this.
Yeah.
It's just like a kind of like, here's a way somebody did it, and
I'm gonna put that
just to kind of like think about.
That's kind of similar to the provides requires from OSGI. Am I just mutating that, or is that just that's how it sounds to me?
I'm not familiar, but it does use a lot of the same words.
The OSGI stuff was a bit more structured.
Yeah.
So the runtime could actually satisfy the dependencies. It sounds like links are kind of opaque from a runtime perspective.
Okay.
Just patched together and pairwise. But I don't know Bosch, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say it wasn't a perfect solution. So that's why I kind of have it up here as like a straw man, because there was like a lot of confusion about how to use links correctly. But I do think it's helpful in looking at like, in terms of how do you make this a scalable solution so you don't have to create workflow specific specs.
Yeah. Yeah. what we have right now in the core spec that allows for people to extend bundle.json is the custom section. And it allows anyone, another spec or a tool or anything like that, to define additional metadata that they want to put into the bundle.json so that you don't need to continually add additional files if it is relevant to the bundle. I just want to throw that out there because that's how the dependency spec is written right now. You can have a bundle say, these are my provides requires or dependencies or however you want to look at it. And it's actually defined in the bundle.json, but it's in a spot where core doesn't care about it whatsoever because core ignores custom completely. I just want to throw it out there, people are aware. But that's something that we can, like, if we like this idea, we can, like, do our normal, like, working group maybe and kind of get more deep into stuff like that. I just wanted to kind of keep this a little more high level and not come up with too many solutions and things like that. Because there's a couple more suggestions that people had. I found them in the comments. So if people are cool with that, I just want to make sure that they get heard. One was dependency order, the order that the dependencies are executed. You know, first it needs to do one thing and then it needs to do another. I don't know if anyone else, I keep thinking I need this. And then sometimes I feel like eventually I realize I don't because the graph kind of shakes out and then the order is enforced by the graph of I need this and then my dependency needs that and the order is enforced through that. And I was curious if anyone else has a use case where they need an explicit like 1, 2, 3, this is the list of what I need, even though they may not depend on each other. I don't know if that makes sense or if I should draw a picture.
Yeah, we're definitely also like planning to, we want to be able to support that sort of thing, but do it by having an API that allows you to generate a directed acyclic graph. So you'd be able to take any given task inside of your workflow and say, I want this to be completed. And then you'll generate a graph of what all the steps are before that can take place. So it's what I just need to share kind of the draft that I've got right now, but it's kind of inspired a little bit by Argo and what's the Cloud Delivery Foundation, Continuous Delivery Foundation one. What am I thinking of? Oh my gosh. But implicitly, if you map any outputs of an installation to parameters of another, then that has to be run first. And then you can also say, just run after some other step if they're not related in any way. And an example of that use case would be like deploy staging and test staging before deploying to prod. So you'd be able to embed that sort of thing inside of your workflow.
Let me make sure I'm capturing that right. So ones that the graph kind of forces first, because like I need this and that needs that, and you've walked through it and you follow the graph, so I know I need all these. Mm-hmm. And then you may have just dangling leaf nodes. It doesn't matter. I just tack those all on at the end, essentially.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
One other thing that's come up that I know, Glenn, you mentioned, and I was curious if you saw a way to make this work with CNAB. It has to do with the OSGI stuff again. You mentioned like you have a bucket of bundles that could be used to satisfy the requirements, So you have these generic requirements. You don't name which bundle you want. You just say, I know I want one that meets these capabilities. How do you limit the space of where you search for these bundles? Are you like looking in just your own private registry? Or when you think about CNAB, because it could come from anywhere, like where would be like the search space for that, where you would then compare who meets those requirements?
There's kind of a repository of bundles, so that's a search space.
Okay, so when you go to install it, would you be like, okay, I want to install this, and you would tell it, limit it to this search space?
Yeah.
Would it be the bundle itself? Or okay, it would be when you install it, the user would pick, compare against this spot?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks.
Is that, we talked before about having like a parameter type that's specifically a OCI image, because there's not really a way to allow the user to pass in custom images that they want to run. And it kind of strikes me as similar, where we might want to allow, like have a defined way to pass in a specific bundle so that it's still referenced by digest, and you have a pinned version that's deterministic. I guess like have a similar mechanism for doing that for images or dependencies, because everything is an OCI artifact if we standardize on that.
I was still writing, I apologize. So I'm having trouble capturing what you just said back in a note. Can you add that to the notes, please?
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'll add that as a question.
Okay.
And it seems like the dependencies between bundles have got, there's the digest is the most brittle and most precise dependency. And then the dependency on the bundle name and version is the next level up. And then requirements and capabilities is a more abstract level still.
Yeah.
So that's a way to think about it. But the resolution process is very simple for the digest. You just dereference the digest and that's the answer. For the high level stuff, it gets more complex because you've got to kind of search and fit and match and that kind of stuff.
Does anyone have a specific example of when they would be relying on a bundle that they don't have a name for, but they would have the set of requirements for? I mean, I wanted that use case, and I've had that use case, like I said, with other things like service brokers. I just wanted to make sure that someone had like a concrete use case that they can articulate in the bundle space. If that makes sense.
We have something similar as the use case about developer inner loop, because we think that if you depend on a bundle which can deploy a database on Azure, we think that you don't want that locally. And maybe you want just that same database, but locally, so you want another bundle for that. So yeah, that's one of our use case.
Okay.
And be able to swap bundles.
I wonder if all possible like bundles that can satisfy the dependency were referenced all together, and then you pass in a parameter to choose between which one you want to use for an installation. But then you can actually digest, like you're referencing all of them by a specific version still.
So that's essentially a manual resolution process then.
Right. But just the same way, if you were testing an image upgrade, you would write a new bundle version, right? You would, if you test a dependency upgrade, you write a new bundle as well.
Was that specifically feedback based on the generic capabilities that you would make different bundles for each one?
Hmm.
I'm just making sure I get the notes right here. I want to make sure I'm capturing this.
Yeah, I'm just saying that maybe if we want some way to allow users to pass in or like to do bundle resolution or just pick which bundle we want to use. If bundles are referenced if dependencies are referenced inside of bundle JSON, I think it might make sense to have a set of all of the bundles that can satisfy a given capability, and then the user can specify a parameter to the top level bundle to pick which one to use for a given installation.
Okay, thanks. That makes more sense.
Yeah.
By the way, I have a question about capabilities. Do you have an example, a precise example of what are the capabilities? Like, is it something I want a database, or I want a precise database with Postgre with a specific version? I mean,
yeah, an example would be a database that is capable of giving you an output that gives you, or maybe like a database that is capable of giving you Postgres 5.7 like capabilities, or Mongo like. For example, Cosmos DB, which is an Azure thing. It doesn't look like Mongo, but it actually can talk to you like Mongo. It has a capability of Mongo, but it isn't, if that makes sense. You can have things that can, as far as the consumer of the credentials is concerned, if it talked to you, it would have the API, essentially, the interface of the service that you're interested. I'm interested in Mongo, or I'm interested in Postgres 5.7, and the shape of the credentials would be something that you know exactly how to connect to your parameters or to your credentials. It would have like a host and a port and a username and a password or something along those lines. And then when you use those against the API that you expect, it would work. That's at least how I personally think about.
Okay. Because I was wondering that as bundles already expose the service images, so maybe they could be sort of capabilities, right?
I'm sorry?
Bundles, they expose, they describe what are the service images they have. So a bundle which is installing a database obviously will show that in the service images, like I'm using that service image, that PostgreSQL and that specific version. So maybe capabilities could be binding with a service images. Like I want to depend on a bundle which specifies this service, maybe.
Oh, you mean driving the capabilities based off of the referenced images?
Yes, because they have like a version, they have a tag, so you can specify on that. Maybe it was just an idea, but maybe it can be part of a solution of the capabilities.
I think that's something we could explore further. I don't know if that's an instant it'll work.
So walking the database use case, what comes to mind is with Mongo is by default, the bundle has a dependency on a Mongo bundle that installs it. But if you provide these credentials, which would be plugged into Cosmos DB Azure Head, then it doesn't kick off that dependency. Is that one of the ways that we can, like that may be probably more in the implementation details of how you would override or say, oh, I don't need this dependency. And by extension, you could either have it be done outside of the bundles where you have an existing database and you just want to create a new table or along those lines, or if you have another bundle that would then fill in the credentials that would then override. That's one way that I can see that kind of playing nicely.
Yeah, this was a problem with service brokers too. This exact same question of making a new instance versus binding to an existing one or adding a new user, new database to a server.
Yeah, that's actually that's actually what drove this experience, was using Service Broker and the challenges of trying to integrate in existing environments. And it was a case of, in hindsight, if I could just being able to explicitly say, hey, here's these credentials. As a result, you don't need to do this. That's one way that it could signal back now. And if we can get enough information in the contract that, you must provide, Postgres interface XYZ, that would be the way. I think one of the early discussions we were talking about, like, what does it actually mean? Like, what does Postgres mean? Just like, what is the actual contract of the dependency providing it, so that if I wanted to swap one in, there's still enough information to validate that I do fulfill that contract.
Yeah. So just make sure I'm capturing that right. Are you saying that we could avoid what happened with service brokers by having more of that information about the binding actually encoded? And by more information about that binding, I mean, like, are you trying to get a user or a database or just a server, putting that into the capability?
Yeah, it's and this is where I'm from the SA world, so I don't know the right word for it, but yeah. It's almost like it's a matter of, either do this or use the credentials that your SA gave you, is kind of the equivalent in the old, giant long Word document of how to do it. So this would be a way of shortcutting that, and by extension would be how you do the dependence, or how this could play into the dependency side is, can we make sure that there's enough meta information, at least to a reasonable extent, that you can actually, I look at it as equivalent of being able to go to your SA and say, or DBA, and say, hey, I need this version of MySQL. And I think that's kind of the real world mirror of what we're doing, is you either create it all from scratch where you're rooted across the world, or you've got to go beg the IT department and put in a ticket or whatever other 1,000 other things you have to actually get it done. But at the end of the day, I need MySQL 5.1 with this version number. And I don't know how much. I know all that information can be part of the bundles, but I haven't walked through to see exactly how much is part of the bundles today, and what would be needed to kind of close that gap between hypothetical and real.
Yeah. So I'm trying to capture that. So we're trying to avoid the complexity of that binding process that brokers had. And so we're trying to say, like, how can we do a little bit of the desired state, I think, that we were talking about with workflows. Were you on the call for that? I forget when you joined. Did you hear about?
Sorry, I had to put my young into bed, so I jumped in at the end, so I can catch up on when the recording goes back up.
Oh, okay. So some of the things we were talking about earlier was maybe having another spec that understands, and like, you guys are going to yell at me, I'm maybe not summarizing this awesome, was being able to say we wanted to have a series of workflow, like a workflow that is outside of the bundle occur, where it's like, I need this, 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 and this to happen in this order. And it's more desired state driven as well. So if something is already in a good state, we're not going to like just imperatively do the action, like you were saying, create the database. We may just go, oh, great, that database already exists. We installed it 3 weeks ago. We're just going to use the one that's already there and pass the credentials along down the workflow to the next step. Does that
pretty
sound like what you're thinking?
I think that that's exactly where my thoughts were going. Probably
okay,
articulated
cool.
better than mine was.
Okay, I'm going to put that as a vote under that then.
I think if I understand that use case correctly, it's like, I want to be able to get credentials from another bundle, or I can just manually pass them in, right?
Yeah, I think that's the gist, or at least the mechanics would look like that. Where and that kind of goes into the I think it's interplayed with both the, do I want to provide them in a different way through that meta process, or do I just want to go with kind of the vanilla, just do everything for me, one click and go.
Yeah, I think we could specify in the runtime that, like, if we're mapping bundle outputs to bundle parameters, we can allow overrides to say, I'm just going to ignore the bundle that provides those outputs, and I'm going to pass them in manually when I run this installation. And that's certainly like part of our migration path. Before we have bundles that support installing whole Kubernetes clusters, we'll have to pass things in manually anyway. So yeah, I think we can definitely account for that.
I have one other question I want to make sure that we got addressed. And if someone else has one that's like a burning question, either leave a comment in chat or like yell at me, just unmute. Which is allowing someone to say whether they want to share a dependency with everyone else or ask that dependency is just for them. So I had two examples that kind of were exact opposites of each other. So one was for load balancers. Okay, I have a bunch of dependencies, like maybe a bunch of little microservices. And because of my cloud provider, the way my cloud provider works, every single one of my little microservices gets their own load balancer. So when I make my mega system bundle, okay, and I include like 6 microservices inside of it, when each one of those microservices asks for a load balancer and requires or depends on that load balancer, they should each get their own instance, okay? So that's one scenario. The flip scenario is I have another like system bundle, like a big like mega bundle that installs everything, for example, like a new environment or something. And I have, again, some more microservices, and they all use a CDN. And the CDN is expensive, and it can do a whole bunch of microservices all at once, and I only need one of them. And so when they all ask for and depend upon a CDN, I'd like for them to all to share one. I don't want to make 5 of them. If I have 5 microservices, I just want to make one. And I was curious if people had thoughts on one, if that sounds valid, or if I'm just being silly, because I'm not ops, okay? And then 2, I was curious if people had thoughts on like, I had an idea for how to accomplish that, but it feels like maybe a hammer. And I was wondering what other people thought about those 2 scenarios. Legit or not?
Legit.
Okay.
Yeah, I could tell it even from cost, but just from, only this shop is authorized to create external IPs. And then everything needs to ride on top of that CDN or load balancer is by, it's the policy. There's no way for a dev to create an external IP even if they wanted. So that would be another reason beyond cost that would drive that use case.
Yeah.
Yeah, same thing with like if you depend on a CRD being installed in a cluster, like that's a cluster admin level thing typically. So you might depend on some shared installation that provides that CRD deployment, controller deployment, and then you just. So I think that's what I was getting at in the idea of a workflow that's a higher level thing that orchestrates defines dependencies between multiple separate installations that can be deployed from different bundles.
Okay. Sweet. Well, we'll keep that in the list then.
And then embedded dependencies where they're like private to that bundle would be potentially described as like with more what we're talking about with the dependency spec, where they're like actually described inside of the bundle JSON itself. And then they're considered part of the same installation.
Okay, let me capture that. Oops, I flipped that around perfectly. Okay. Okay. So the load balancer one, where each one gets their own, is, you were saying, an embedded dependency is defined in the bundle. The shared CDN one is more of a workflow thing that maybe would be considered almost an external dependency, and it wouldn't be defined inside of the bundle. That was what you were saying?
Yeah.
Can I capture that? Okay, thanks. So we got 2 minutes left. I'm so excited. I think this went really well, but I'm the one talking the whole time, so of course I'm happy. Is there anything else we need to get in before we finish? I'd like to maybe start a working group just to kind of help fill this out from here and maybe try to steal all this wonderful workflow stuff from y'all.
I would like to call out that I just recently attended the CNCF SIG application delivery meeting, and they had some kind of interesting conversation along these lines as well, where they're defining, I can link this in the CNAB channel, but they, like, right now we're working on some kind of shared definitions between different runtimes and platforms. And a lot of the discussion was centered around this idea of multiple layers of applications and platform and workflows, application rollout level configuration. I'll link that document, but I think what we're talking about with workflows kind of really fits nicely into that diagram. So.
Cool. Yeah, so if I think this is suitable for a working group, or we can maybe have a couple more one-off meetings to try to come up with like a new spec or two, maybe a dependency plus a workflow spec. That seem fine for people? So maybe another doodle or two to figure out time for people to get together and help lay down that first based on all of our use cases. All right, that's what I'm gonna do then. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, you. Bye.